You're now listening to the 10th installment of Felix firing off from afar for the flyover. This is Felix. And Felix is going to begin today by discussing the California Faculty Association, the CFA, and the CFA's recent strike authorization vote. So, the CFA, representing thousands of teachers and professors and others involved with the California State University system, and over 94% of CFA members voted yes to authorize the union to call a strike or take other necessary actions if the ongoing negotiations with the Cal State University management fail to result in a deal that the union considers fair. And on Tuesday, November 17th, the day Felix officially leaves his 20s behind him with an important birthday, there's going to be this rally and march at the Board of Trustees meeting in Long Beach, California. And so the main sticking point in those negotiations between the CFA and the Cal State University management have to do with the CFA fighting for a 5% general salary increase for all faculty and a 2.65% service salary increase for eligible faculty. And the university management, they're unwilling to accept anything more than a 2% general salary increase, despite the wages being quite stagnant for some time. And so it's worth pointing out that some lecturers, the adjuncts and contingent faculty, Felix included, make less than $800 per month for each class. And of course, those lecturers are often unable to pick up too many classes. So the increase in the GSI is something that seems very sensible and something very needed. And thus it makes quite a lot of sense to support the strike efforts and show solidarity in that regard. Now, having said that, Felix also wants to provide a critical interrogation into the labor movement and higher education. And so I'll start by referencing a t-shirt, union t-shirt for higher education union that he's seen. The slogan that appears on it, "I don't want to strike, but I will," which is, I think, instructive. And so it kind of highlights the difference between conventional unions, or what remains of them anyway, versus what a militant labor movement might look like, but does not yet exist in any really potent form. And so teachers and professors, right, generally tend to prefer to avoid things like strikes. It interrupts their regular flow of doing things, which for some, right, entails quite awful routine experiences. Nevertheless, there's this justification that's given, and it probably makes sense on a very superficial level that teaching is valuable, and we shouldn't disrupt that and don't want the university to be destroyed or go under on account of something like a strike. In fact, I'm sure you've heard arguments that were quite similar when the Faculty Association at Southern Illinois University Carbondale, for those of you listeners in the Carbondale area, back when the Faculty Association at SIUC went on strike in 2011, those who were opposed to the action, that was one of the justifications, that you can't let the university suffer. And so a militant labor movement, or a critical consciousness and the militancy that supports it, would interpret the situation very differently and then act accordingly. A strike would, in contrast, be seen as a potent pedagogical experience, teaching students something very important about collective action, solidarity, and the state of affairs within the university and the capitalist economy writ large. Also, for many, the university in its current operation, which sees presidents making several $100,000 while adjunct professors forced to work as Felix does, bagging groceries and retrieving shopping carts on the side at a local area grocery store, that's wholly incompatible with any notion of economic justice or with the kind of operation or function that is acceptable for an institution. Okay, so, and I'll add as a side note that working low wages, working at the grocery store, also low wages there, like at the university. So, despite formal representation in both instances, And so that's another potential indictment and constructive criticism, perhaps, of organized labor today. And a militant labor movement would entail then objectives of overcoming quite honestly capitalist social relations and class divisions that should be made visible as an initial objective, and that are already visible for those not in the thick of ideological fog within the university itself. More on that in just a moment. And so, critical interrogation of union structures. We're going to continue with that. Conventional higher education unions. They're quite explicit about keeping professors in the middle class. I've heard that bandied about quite a bit. And so that implies, quite obviously, recognition of the legitimacy of class divisions, which, of course, if we're going to be truly consistent with our ideals of economic justice, we should be rejecting and seeking to transcend. Business unions are not adept at doing this. It turns out they're more adept at actually maintaining those divisions. And as Felix was thinking about all this, he was reminded of a passage from theorist Herbert Marcuse's book, Soviet Marxism, A Critical Analysis. And this was published back in 1958, so when the Soviet Union was still in existence. And Marcuse comments on the Soviet bureaucracy and the associated bureaucratic class. So I'm just going to read this quick excerpt. Marcuse wrote that inasmuch as the bureaucracy is a separate class with special privileges and powers, it has an interest in self-perpetuation and, consequently, in perpetuating repressive production and political relations. And so it's interesting to consider whether a similar analysis applies to modern-day union bureaucracies, or if this is also true in terms of, say, the relatively privileged versus the more thoroughly exploited and degraded within present-day institutions like the university, if they indeed represent two different classes with distinct, or at least oftentimes many different interests, then there's one class by virtue of its stratification, then have an interest in perpetuating its own relative power and privilege over the other. And so this is perhaps a predicament. And the California Faculty Association, it's worth pointing out, represents both non-tenure track professors, the adjuncts, the contingent labor, and then also tenure track and tenured professors. And so there's a serious question that needs to be asked. To what extent do existing union structures reproduce the power asymmetries and serious wage disparities that result in serious differences in material conditions between adjuncts on the one hand and tenure line and tenured professors on the other? And again, for those not in the thick of ideological fog, I think many of these class divisions are apparent within the university. The déclassé intellectuals are distinct from the relatively privileged professorial class, in other words. And the déclassé intellectuals would, of course, refer to the excess of educated persons in denied work in today's crisis-riddled capitalist economy. Those that would previously have been they're denied the kind of work that would previously have been commensurate with their level of education. And also it would encompass those who are downwardly mobile generally, earning less and forced to take worse jobs than, say, their parents' generation. And then in contrast, you have the relatively privileged, relatively powered, declining professorial class, because with the neoliberalization of the university, in conjunction with the shift towards tuition fees-based payments in order to support the university system, there's also, which is of course debt financed, there's also been a shift toward more and more adjunct labor, up between 30 and 70%, depending on who you ask and how you determine what counts as contingent. So examples then of the professorial class, the dwindling professorial class. Well, and then also of the ideas and actions that are indicative of the problematic privilege that class has. So we'll start with Wendy Brown, who is a famous political scientist, prolific writer on the subject of neoliberalism, which is basically capitalism in its current phase of market discipline for the disempowered majority. And so Brown is a major critic of neoliberalism, but the distance between that and her actions reflecting professorial class ideology are marked. In a 2014 article that appeared in Al Jazeera America, authored by Malcolm Harris, titled Grad Students of the World Unite, he noted that back in 2009, when students in the University of California system were engaged in a fight against an impending 32% fee increase, the famed scholar of neoliberalism, UC Berkeley professor Wendy Brown, sent an email complaining that protesters were insufficiently invested in the school's preservation. She said that, "I feel like we're dealing with 10-year-olds." She added that it's tedious, it's infuriating, and it's wasting a lot of valuable time and energy while the greatest public university in the world is slipping away from us. She also issued a statement for UC Berkeley faculty after a protest at the Chancellor's House when some property was damaged, again in the wake of this impending 32% tuition fee increase. And this was also after serious and well-documented repression and physical violence by police used to quell protests. And Brown said in that email that neither round of violence is intrinsically justified and neither justifies the other. We, faculty, are not having debates. We're condemning what happened at the Chancellor's House just as we condemn the police violence outside Wheeler on November 20th. And so, condemning equally the police university violence with concerted efforts against that structural violence and against that repression. So that would seem a bit problematic and also disappointing for someone who is purportedly a political theorist specializing on the subject of neoliberalism. Similarly, her colleague at the University of California, Berkeley, George Lakoff, a cognitive scientist and self-styled framing strategist, his position echoed the insidious ideology of the privileged professorial class as well. He tried to convince students occupying a building at UC in 2009, again, those that were protesting the impending tuition fee increase, told occupiers that police had not fired rubber bullets or hurt students outside the building, even though there was, and they did. And finally, one last example, Simon Springer, who is the associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria in Canada. So he has argued for downplaying class analysis in some of his writing and suggests that it's key for anarchists today, and it hardly requires comment to point out how that might be ideologically self-serving for the relatively privileged professorial class. Also, Springer argues that, quote, all violence is deplorable, which it doesn't take long to realize puts the U.S. bombing of, say, a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, for example, which occurred on October 3rd and killed at least 30 people, including 13 staff members and 10 patients, puts that on par with, say, the Kurdish YPJ or Women's Protection units defending themselves in the revolution in Rojava against fundamentalism and state repression. And for those of you who have not listened to these Félix updates or the Counterpower Radio Hour or Counterpower After Hours in a while, Rojava is the autonomous area of 3 non-contiguous cantons located within Syria's borders, and taking place in Rojava is a social transformation where communal self-governance and direct democracy are the order of the day. In fact, there was a front page New York Times article this last week on November 11th, titled On the Road in Syria, Struggle All Around, that mentioned Rojava, and it also mentioned the indirect influence that an American anarchist socialist thinker, Murray Bookchin, had on Abdullah Öcalan, who is the leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, whose thought and model of democratic confederalism has strongly influenced what's actually going on in Rojava. But point being that the violence of Springer's nonviolence doctrinaire philosophy of nonviolence is again illustrative of that same professorial class ideology. As David Graeber pointed out in his article Beyond Power Knowledge a couple years back, many radicals migrated to the university and increasingly became divorced from social struggles after the 1960s and 1970s. And riffing on Graeber just a bit, I'd add that a declining sliver of faculty, those in the relatively privileged sector, are also divorced from the struggles of those lower in the academic hierarchy. And these class distinctions in the university, the stratification within the university, it's erased. There's that ideology at work, and it's supported by this idea that teaching is supposed to be something you love and don't do for money, which is good in a kind of gross way because adjuncts hardly make any of it. But that notion is ideological justification for accepting low wage, per semester, contract, precarious labor, and also those in the more privileged professorial class positions are not subject to it, and they can thus assume their contingent colleagues should and must love their work too. And that ideology is especially important among the privileged sector of the professorial class. It reflects their material advantages and serves to normalize and reproduce those disparities to the level of ideas. Now, interestingly, David Graeber also gave a talk at the occupation, the Matten House, at the University of Amsterdam back in the spring. And one of the things that he said was that class is something to consider in terms of the way that we conduct direct democracy and hold general assemblies and organize generally, just as race and gender and other forms of oppression should be accounted for. And from what Felix gathers, there have recently been workshops at the Flyover Info Shop at 214 North Washington, there in Carbondale, Illinois, that have focused on anti-blackness and structural racism, how it insidiously affects even radicals and even anarchists who've historically been most adamant about recognizing and rejecting myriad forms of domination. But what I think is important to struggle against too is the silence on class oppression, whether it's taking place within the university and reproduced within the university or more broadly throughout society. And that silence comes at our own peril and at the expense of many others suffering, for that matter, too. So perhaps workshops on class might be in order, but not just on class as an identity, but on class and overcoming class divisions. Which brings me to my final point about the potentially catalytic role of the déclassé intellectual. And I would differentiate that the potentially catalytic role from any kind of vanguardist role. That is, I'm not suggesting that the déclassé intellectuals that I referenced before should be assuming and holding any kind of power over others. Rather, insofar as the déclassé have a level of education, cultural competence, analytical, technical expertise, including technological proficiency, maybe skills in communication in the media arts, that can be used and should be used to inform and communicate, not dictate struggles. And for me, this would entail not just tactics and strategy, that's far too limiting, and it also presupposes some consensus regarding the objectives that tactics and strategies are undertaken to achieve, and I don't think that consensus always exists. So rather, it would also entail theory and ideas to clarify those goals to be achieved, and then it could maybe inform the tactics and strategy, and maybe put that in with some comprehensive framework so that when you achieve one goal, that can be part of a process of expanding the realm of freedom, if you will. And that all should be our primary pedagogical task now. And so this has been Felix firing off from afar for the flyover. I'll be back at you next time.